Handong sin huck. The first note did not explode into the room the way everyone expected. It did not stumble or hesitate or search for its place. It arrived softly, precisely, like a whisper that somehow carried more authority than any loud performance ever could. And in that single instant, something shifted in the air. The audience did not laugh. They did not even breathe the same way, because that sound, that single, perfectly controlled note, did not belong to someone who was guessing. It belonged to someone who knew exactly where she was going. Margaret's fingers moved again, the second note flowing into the first with a smoothness that erased any lingering doubt, and then the third, and the fourth, each one placed with deliberate intention, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But her hands told a completely different story. They moved with quiet confidence, gliding across the keys with a familiarity that no beginner could fake. Daniel Whitaker's smile remained on his face, but it had begun to stiffen, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he leaned a fraction closer, as if trying to understand what he was hearing, because this was not how the moment was supposed to unfold. This was not the awkward stumble he had planned for. The judges exchanged glances again, this time sharper, more alert, one of them sitting up straighter, his fingers pressing lightly against the table as if grounding himself in the reality of what was happening. Margaret continued, the melody unfolding now with increasing complexity, her left hand anchoring the rhythm with steady precision while her right hand danced across the higher register, weaving patterns that were both intricate and effortless. And still, she did not rush. She did not try to impress. She simply played, as if the performance was not for the audience, not for the cameras, but for something far more personal, far more internal. The studio, once filled with anticipation of laughter, had fallen into a deeper silence, the kind that feels almost heavy, where every small movement seems amplified, where the sound of a breath, a shift in a chair, even the faint hum of the lighting rigs becomes noticeable, and yet none of it distracted from the music that now filled the space completely. Backstage, the same production assistant who had whispered earlier now stared at the monitor, her eyes wide. That is not normal, she said quietly, and no one around her disagreed. On stage, Daniel took a small step back, almost imperceptible, but enough to create distance between himself and the unfolding moment. His role as orchestrator slipping away as the narrative he had constructed began to collapse. Margaret's fingers accelerated slightly, not in panic, not in desperation, but in controlled intensity, the piece revealing its true difficulty now, cascading runs and sharp transitions that demanded not just skill, but mastery. And she met each challenge without hesitation, without strain, her hands never faltering, her timing exact, her touch deliberate. The judges were no longer amused. They were watching intently now, one of them leaning forward so far that his elbows rested on the table, his mouth slightly open as recognition began to form. Because this was not just talent, this was training, years of it, the kind that leaves a signature in every movement, the kind that cannot be hidden beneath simple clothing or quiet demeanor. Margaret's expression remained composed, but there was something else now, something deeper. A connection to the music that transformed the performance from technical execution into something emotional, something that reached beyond the stage and into the audience itself. A woman in the front row slowly lowered her phone, forgetting to record, her attention fully captured. A man beside her shook his head in disbelief, whispering under his breath, "Who is she?" But there was no answer, not yet, because Margaret Hayes, the quiet old woman they had expected to laugh at, was no longer fitting into any category they understood. And as her hands continued to move with unwavering precision, one truth began to settle into the room. Subtle but undeniable. This was no accident. This was no lucky moment. This was something far more significant, something that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the exact moment it could no longer be ignored, and that moment had just begun. The music did not simply continue. It evolved, rising into something far more commanding than anyone in that room had anticipated. The gentle precision of the opening now transforming into a powerful cascade of sound that filled every corner of the studio, each note striking with clarity and purpose, and Margaret's hands, steady and controlled, moved with a confidence that erased any remaining doubt about who she truly was. The complexity of the piece unfolding in layers, rapid passages, interwoven with delicate phrasing, her left hand maintaining a foundation so solid it felt unshakable, while her right hand soared above it with fluid elegance. And still, there was no tension in her shoulders, no visible strain, only quiet mastery, as if the instrument was not something she was trying to conquer, but something she had known her entire life. Daniel Whitaker no longer smiled. His expression had shifted into something tighter, something uncertain. His posture no longer relaxed as he stood just off to the side, watching not as a host in control, but as a man realizing he had misjudged a situation completely. One of the judges leaned toward the other, whispering something urgent, his voice low but filled with recognition, and the other nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Margaret with a new intensity, because this performance was no longer about surprise. It was about revelation. The audience, once eager for entertainment, now sat completely still, their earlier amusement replaced by a growing sense of awe. A young man in the third row blinked repeatedly as if trying to process what he was witnessing. A woman near the aisle pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes glistening as the music carried an emotional weight that went beyond technical brilliance. And that was the moment it became undeniable. This was not just skill. This was history. Margaret's fingers accelerated again, moving through a sequence so demanding that even seasoned performers would approach it with caution, yet she did not hesitate. She did not falter. Each movement executed with precision and control, her timing exact, her expression unchanged. But beneath that calm exterior, there was something deeper, something that connected every note into a story only she fully understood. Backstage, a senior producer removed his headset halfway, his focus no longer on the logistics of the show, but entirely on the monitor in front of him. "Who booked her?" he asked, not expecting an answer, because no one seemed to have one. On stage, the camera operators adjusted instinctively, tightening their shots, capturing the subtle movements of her hands, the unwavering focus in her eyes, the slight rise and fall of her breath, all the details that now mattered more than any scripted moment. Daniel took another step back, this time more noticeable, his presence shrinking against the magnitude of what was unfolding, the narrative he had built, the laughter he had expected, all of it dissolving in real time, replaced by something far more powerful and far less controllable. One of the judges, unable to contain himself, leaned forward and whispered, barely audible, "That phrasing, that control, this is not amateur." And the realization spread quickly across the panel, their earlier expressions of amusement now replaced with respect, even disbelief. Margaret reached a section of the piece where the music demanded both speed and delicacy at once, a balance that very few could achieve. Yet her fingers moved as if guided by instinct, each note landing exactly where it belonged. The transitions seamless, the dynamics perfectly measured, and as the sound swelled, filling the studio with a richness that seemed almost impossible for a single performer to create, the audience leaned in collectively, drawn into the performance in a way they had not expected, forgetting the cameras, forgetting the show, forgetting everything except the music. And in that moment, the truth became impossible to ignore. Margaret Hayes had not come here to prove anything. She had not come to defend herself or respond to mockery. She had simply accepted an invitation, and in doing so, she had revealed something that no one in that room had been prepared to witness, something that could not be undone, could not be laughed away, something that would change how every single person there remembered this night. And as her hands continued to move with unwavering certainty, one final realization settled into the silence surrounding her. The woman they had underestimated was not rising to the occasion. She had been far above it from the very beginning. The final passage did not rush toward its ending. It commanded it, the music swelling with a force that felt almost larger than the room itself. Each note landing with absolute certainty, each transition executed with a precision that left no space for doubt. And Margaret Hayes remained exactly as she had been from the first note, composed, grounded, completely in control, her fingers moving with a speed and clarity that seemed to defy her quiet appearance. The grand piano no longer just an instrument but a voice, carrying something deeper, something that resonated far beyond technical brilliance. And as the final sequence approached, the most demanding part of the piece, a section known for exposing even the smallest weakness, the entire studio held its breath, not out of anticipation of failure, but out of something else entirely, something closer to reverence. Daniel Whitaker stood frozen now, no longer attempting to guide the moment, his hands resting awkwardly at his sides. His carefully crafted confidence replaced by a silence he could not control, because this was no longer his stage. It had not been for several minutes, and everyone knew it. The judges sat forward, their attention unwavering, one of them slowly shaking his head, not in disbelief anymore, but in recognition, the kind that comes when something undeniable reveals itself without permission. Margaret's hands moved into the final run, a rapid cascade of notes that demanded flawless execution, and she delivered it without hesitation, each note clean, each phrase connected, her timing exact to the very last fraction of a second. And then, just as suddenly as it had built, the music resolved, the final chord resonating through the studio with a richness that lingered in the air, refusing to disappear. Her hands lifted gently from the keys, hovering for a moment before settling back into her lap. And in that instant, the room did not react. There was no immediate applause, no sudden noise, only silence, deep and complete, the kind of silence that follows something extraordinary, the kind that acknowledges without needing to explain. Margaret did not look up right away. She remained still, as if allowing the last note to fully exist before moving on. And when she finally raised her eyes, they were calm, steady, unchanged, as though nothing unusual had happened, as though she had simply done what she always did. And for a brief second, no one moved. The audience sat frozen, the judges silent, the cameras continuing to record a moment that had slipped entirely beyond the control of production. And then, slowly, a single sound broke through, a pair of hands clapping, tentative at first, coming from the front row, followed by another, and another, until the entire room erupted, the applause building rapidly into something overwhelming. People rising to their feet, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect, the kind that cannot be forced, the kind that is earned in a moment and remembered long after. Daniel blinked, the sound of the applause pulling him back into a reality he had not expected. He glanced toward the judges, toward the audience, toward Margaret, and for the first time that night, he had no words ready, no clever remark, no controlled narrative, only the unmistakable realization that he had been wrong, completely and publicly wrong. One of the judges stood as well, stepping closer to the edge of the panel, his voice carrying over the applause as he spoke, not to entertain, but to acknowledge. That was not just impressive, he said, his tone firm, certain. That was master-level performance. The audience responded with even louder applause, the recognition spreading like a wave. Margaret inclined her head slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Nothing more, no grand reaction, no attempt to claim the moment, because she did not need to. The moment had already spoken for itself, and as the applause continued, filling the studio with a sound that could not be ignored, one truth settled quietly beneath it all. Respect had replaced mockery, and it had happened. Not through argument, not through defense, but through undeniable excellence, the kind that does not ask to be seen, but cannot be overlooked once revealed. And in that room, under those bright lights, everyone understood something they would not easily forget. Greatness does not announce itself, it waits, and when it finally appears, it leaves no room for doubt. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, rising and falling in waves that filled the studio with a kind of energy no script could ever manufacture. People remained on their feet longer than expected, some exchanging glances of disbelief, others simply watching Margaret Hayes as if trying to reconcile the quiet woman they had seen minutes ago with the performance they had just witnessed. And through it all, she remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting gently in her lap, her posture unchanged, as though the magnitude of what had just happened did not belong to her, but to the music itself. Daniel Whitaker finally stepped forward, the sound of his shoes against the stage floor returning a sense of structure to a moment that had completely escaped his control. But even now, his movements were slower, more measured, the confidence that once defined him replaced with something quieter, something closer to humility. He paused a few feet away from Margaret, the applause still echoing behind him, and for a brief moment, he seemed unsure of how to proceed. A rare hesitation for someone who had built a career on always having the next line ready. "Margaret," he began, his voice no longer carrying the playful edge from earlier, but instead something more careful, more respectful. That was extraordinary. The word felt insufficient, and he knew it, but it was all he had in that moment. Margaret looked up at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady, offering no sign of triumph. No indication that she had just shifted the entire tone of the show. "Thank you," she replied simply, her voice soft but clear, and that simplicity, that lack of spectacle, only deepened the contrast between who she was and what she had just done. One of the judges stood and stepped closer, unable to remain seated any longer, his earlier recognition now fully formed into certainty. "Ma'am," he said, addressing her with a level of respect that had been entirely absent before. "May I ask, where did you train?" The question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement that her skill belonged to a world far beyond casual experience. Margaret paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but as if considering how much to reveal. The studio quieting again, the audience leaning in, drawn not by curiosity alone but by a growing sense that there was more to this story than they had been allowed to see. "A long time ago," she said finally, her tone gentle, "I studied at the New England Conservatory." A murmur moved through the crowd, subtle but immediate, the name carrying weight, history, prestige. One of the judges exchanged a quick glance with another, recognition flashing across his face. "Hayes," he repeated softly, as if testing the name against a memory. "Margaret Hayes." That would not happen to be the same Margaret Hayes who performed at Carnegie Hall in the late 1970s. The room seemed to hold its breath again, the question transforming the moment from surprise into revelation. Margaret met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "It has been many years," she replied, not confirming directly, but not denying it either, and that was enough. The realization spread quickly. The quiet woman in a beige cardigan was not just talented. She was someone who had once stood on some of the most prestigious stages in the country, someone who had stepped away from that world without explanation, without announcement, and now, without intention, had returned to it in the most unexpected way possible. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of his earlier assumptions settling fully into place, his attempt to create a moment of light entertainment now revealed as something else entirely, something that reflected more on him than on her. "I think," he said, turning slightly toward the audience, his voice steadier now but undeniably changed. "We may have underestimated our guest tonight." The statement drew a soft ripple of agreement, but no laughter, because there was nothing amusing left in the situation, only understanding. Margaret rose from the bench, her movements unhurried, composed. She offered a small nod toward the judges, then toward the audience, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than acceptance of praise. Because she had not come seeking recognition, she had simply responded when asked, and in doing so, had reminded everyone in that room of something they had momentarily forgotten. That true mastery does not need introduction, it does not rely on appearance, and it certainly does not disappear simply because it has been out of sight. And as the applause began to rise again, softer this time, but no less sincere, one truth settled quietly over the studio. Respect is not given to those who demand attention. It is given to those who prove, without words, that they never needed it in the first place. The studio did not return to normal, not immediately, because something fundamental had shifted in the space, something that could not simply be reset with a commercial break or a change in lighting. The energy that once fed on anticipation and amusement had transformed into something quieter, more reflective, and as Margaret Hayes stepped away from the piano, the path in front of her seemed different now, not physically, but in the way people looked at her, the way the audience's eyes followed her movement with a kind of respect that had not been there before. Daniel Whitaker cleared his throat softly, an unconscious gesture that betrayed the weight of the moment settling on him. He turned slightly toward the control room as if expecting guidance, but none came, because there was no script for this, no prepared line that could restore the balance he had lost. He faced the audience again, his expression composed but undeniably altered. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that had been absent at the beginning of the segment. "Would you be willing to share why you stopped performing?" The question hung in the air, not intrusive, but careful, shaped by a recognition that this was no longer about entertainment. Margaret paused, her hand resting lightly against the side of the piano, her gaze lowering for just a moment before lifting again. And in that brief pause, there was a quiet depth that spoke more than any immediate answer could. The audience leaned in, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a growing connection to the story unfolding in front of them. "Life," she said finally, her voice steady, unembellished, yet carrying a weight that resonated across the room. A single word, simple and complete, and somehow it was enough, because everyone understood what it implied. The changes, the sacrifices, the unseen paths that lead people away from the stages they once stood upon. One of the judges nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a truth he had witnessed many times before but rarely heard expressed so plainly. "You do not lose that kind of ability," he said quietly, more to the room than to her. "You carry it with you." Margaret offered a small smile, not proud, not nostalgic, just present. "It never leaves," she replied, and the way she said it carried no regret, only acceptance. Daniel shifted his weight again, his earlier confidence replaced with a kind of humility that was new even to him. He looked out at the audience, then back at Margaret, and for the first time that evening, his role as host felt secondary, almost unnecessary. "I think," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we all just witnessed something very rare." The audience responded not with laughter, but with quiet agreement. A few nods, a few murmured affirmations, because what had happened on that stage was not something that could be easily categorized or dismissed. It was not a performance meant to entertain for a moment and then fade. It was a reminder, and reminders have a way of staying longer than expected. Backstage, the senior producer leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, the numbers on the monitor showing viewership climbing rapidly. But for once, the metrics felt secondary to the moment itself. "Keep rolling," he said quietly, even though no one had suggested stopping on stage. Margaret stood calmly, the center of attention without ever seeking it. And as the applause began to rise again, softer but more deliberate, Daniel stepped slightly to the side, giving her space, not out of showmanship, but out of recognition that this moment belonged entirely to her. The audience responded in kind, their applause steady, respectful, not overwhelming, but sustained, as if they were unwilling to let the moment pass too quickly. One of the judges spoke again, this time with a tone that carried both admiration and something deeper, something closer to gratitude. "Thank you for reminding us," he said simply, and Margaret inclined her head once more, her expression unchanged, because she had not come to remind anyone of anything. She had simply responded to what was placed before her, and in doing so, had revealed something that could not be ignored. As the cameras continued to capture every angle, every expression, every subtle shift in the room, one quiet truth settled in, not announced, not declared, but understood by everyone present, that respect, once earned in a moment like this, does not fade with the applause. It stays, long after the lights dim, and the show moves on. And in that realization, the silence that followed carried more meaning than anything that had been said before. The applause gradually softened, not because the audience had lost interest, but because something more reflective had taken its place, a quiet understanding that lingered beneath the surface of the moment. Margaret Hayes stood calmly at center stage, no longer defined by the expectations that had once surrounded her, but by the undeniable truth she had revealed. And as the cameras continued to roll, capturing every subtle shift in expression, every glance, every breath, the weight of what had just happened began to settle not only in the studio, but far beyond it, in living rooms across the country where viewers watched in silence. Their initial curiosity transformed into something far more meaningful. Daniel Whitaker, still adjusting to the unexpected turn of events, stepped forward once more, his movements measured, his voice quieter than before. "Margaret," he said, pausing briefly as if choosing his words with care, "I think I owe you something." The statement carried a different kind of gravity, one that was not scripted, not rehearsed, but genuine. Margaret turned her attention to him, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, without judgment, giving him the space to continue. And for a moment, Daniel hesitated, a rare occurrence for someone so accustomed to control. But then he spoke. "I misjudged you," he admitted, his voice clear enough for the entire room to hear, the honesty of the statement cutting through any remaining tension. The audience responded with a soft murmur, not surprised, but acknowledging the significance of what he had just said, because it was not just an apology to Margaret. It was an acknowledgement of something deeper, something that everyone in that room had, in some way, been a part of. Margaret gave a slight nod, not as acceptance, but as recognition that the moment had reached a point where no further explanation was needed. One of the judges leaned forward again, his voice thoughtful, almost reflective. "Moments like this," he said slowly, "they remind us how easy it is to overlook greatness when it does not announce itself." His words settled into the room with quiet impact, drawing nods from the audience, reinforcing a realization that had already begun to take shape. Backstage, the production team watched in silence, the usual urgency replaced by a stillness that mirrored the atmosphere on stage. The numbers on the monitor continued to climb, but for once, the metrics felt secondary, because what they were witnessing could not be reduced to ratings or clips. It was something more enduring, something that would be remembered long after the broadcast ended. On stage, Margaret remained composed, her presence steady, grounded, and as Daniel stepped slightly aside, giving her the space she had never asked for but had fully earned, the audience responded once more, their applause rising again, not as a reaction, but as a statement, a collective acknowledgement of respect, and this time, it carried a different tone, one that was not driven by surprise, but by understanding, the kind of understanding that comes when a moment reveals something true, something that cannot be undone or forgotten. The camera slowly pulled back, capturing the full scene, the grand piano still at center stage, the audience standing, the judges attentive, and Margaret Hayes, the quiet figure who had transformed the entire narrative without raising her voice or demanding attention. And as the applause continued, steady and sincere, one final realization settled over the room, not spoken, not written, but felt by everyone present, that dignity does not need to defend itself. It reveals itself in moments like this, when silence speaks louder than mockery, and excellence leaves no room for doubt. And in that understanding, the night found its true meaning, not in the performance alone, but in what it had uncovered, a truth that extended far beyond the stage, far beyond the cameras, into the way people would remember this moment, and perhaps, into the way they would see others from that day forward. The lights of Studio 7 eventually dimmed, not abruptly, but with a slow, deliberate fade that matched the quiet transformation the room had undergone. And as the applause finally settled into silence, it was not the kind of silence that signaled an ending, but the kind that marked something lasting, something that would not simply disappear once the cameras stopped recording. Margaret Hayes stood near the grand piano for a final moment, her presence calm, unshaken, untouched by the intensity that had surrounded her. And when she turned to leave the stage, there was no rush in her steps, no attempt to hold onto the spotlight, because she had never come seeking it. The audience watched her go, many still standing, some lowering themselves slowly into their seats as if reluctant to break the connection they had just experienced. Daniel Whitaker remained where he was, his gaze following her for a second longer than necessary, as if trying to fully absorb what had just unfolded before. He returned to his role, but even as he turned back toward the cameras, something about him had changed, something subtle yet undeniable. The sharp edge of his usual confidence replaced with a quieter awareness, one shaped by a moment he could not control and could not undo. Backstage, the production team began to move again, voices returning, equipment shifting, but even there, the tone had shifted, conversations softer, more reflective, as if everyone understood that they had witnessed something that did not belong to the usual rhythm of the show. One of the assistants glanced at the monitor, replaying the final seconds of Margaret's performance, her expression thoughtful. "That is going to stay with people," she said quietly, and no one disagreed. Back on stage, Daniel faced the audience once more, the camera light blinking red, signaling that they were still live. But for a brief moment, he did not speak, allowing the silence to exist just a little longer, allowing the weight of the moment to settle fully before moving forward. And when he finally did speak, his voice carried none of the earlier playfulness, only sincerity. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the most powerful moments are the ones we never planned for." The audience responded with a soft murmur, a shared acknowledgement that needed no elaboration, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. He offered a small nod, not to the cameras, not to the producers, but toward the space Margaret had just left, a quiet gesture of respect that spoke louder than any scripted closing ever could. The show continued. As it always did, segments followed, conversations resumed, but something lingered beneath it all, a subtle shift in perspective that could not be erased. And beyond the studio, in homes across the country, viewers sat in their living rooms, some still holding their phones, others staring at their screens a little longer than usual, replaying the moment in their minds. The image of a quiet woman sitting at a piano, underestimated, dismissed, and then revealed, not through words, not through argument, but through undeniable excellence. And in that image, there was something more than entertainment, something that reached beyond the boundaries of a television program and into something more personal, more reflective, a reminder that appearances do not define ability, that silence does not mean absence, and that true mastery does not seek validation. It reveals itself when given the smallest opportunity. Margaret Hayes walked out of the building that night the same way she had entered, quietly, without announcement, the cool evening air meeting her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights stretching out before her, unchanged, indifferent to what had just happened inside. And yet, for those who had witnessed it, nothing felt quite the same, because in a world that often moves too quickly to notice what lies beneath the surface, she had offered a moment of clarity, a moment that reminded everyone watching that dignity does not need to be defended. And that day, under the bright lights of a stage built for spectacle, the world was reminded what quiet greatness truly looks like.